The campaign School of Something was recently co-organized by the General Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation under Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development and the United Nations Development Program UNDP with the support of the Japanese government. This is part of the UNDP project on raising awareness and preparedness for tsunami in Asia and the Pacific. The campaign raises awareness for students in selected schools throughout Vietnam through education and training activities on tsunami and natural disasters such as something admission, something training, and something safety.
Con cảm thấy buổi tập huấn này rất bổ ích vì nó mang lại cho con những kỹ năng như là sơ cấp cứu, đóng bào, sóng sét, vân vân. Và sau những buổi học này con sẽ về và tuyên truyền lại cho những người thân, những người mà con quen biết để họ có được những kỹ năng khi mà bão hoặc là sóng thần đến.
It is very important to raise the awareness of the natural disasters among the young generation. Like for example, 5 years ago in Japan, so there was a strong earthquake and the following a strong tsunami, which deprived a lot of life of the young generations. Because the young people do not know how to do in the case of the natural disasters.
One of the most common reasons for natural disasters to become increasingly dangerous is a lack of awareness as well as ineffective disaster response as they occur. In the context of climate change becoming more complex, accumulation of knowledge on disaster response is extremely necessary, especially for children. Hello, you're watching Sharing Vietnam. Natural disasters are increasingly and extremely complex in the world. In Vietnam, during hurricane season, students in the flood-affected areas are particularly badly impacted. Today, let's have a talk with Ms. Caitlin Whitson to get more insights of the project that UNDP is working on to raise awareness of and prevent natural disaster, including the Something School campaign. Hello, thank you for joining our show today. So who was the most vulnerable to natural disaster? And from the recent Typhoon Damri, how do you think Vietnam should improve natural disaster prevention?
Thank you. It's a very important question. And those who are among the most vulnerable to disasters are those who are elderly, those who are disabled, those who are young, and those who are vulnerable. And for them, it's absolutely critical in the early days to be able to find safe shelter. I would say that the government of Vietnam has been extremely proactive in this case and is doing a lot of good work on the ground. And there's still, unfortunately, more to come. One of the areas that is extremely important in this context is shelter and sustainable housing. And right now, UNDP and the government of Vietnam are working on a Green Climate Fund program. And in that program, we're developing what we call storm resilient housing. So it's housing for poor people and those on the vulnerable coastal areas that can withstand the next storm and floods. It can withstand storms up to 12 to 14 level, which is really quite high. Another key measure is really about awareness. This is really building disaster awareness and understanding when a disaster hits and it impacts, what do you need to do? What are the first actions you need to do? So that kind of preparedness is absolutely key. Then the second thing that's very important to do is also looking at how can we reduce the risks to disaster for all the different infrastructure and economies. The third and final one would be looking at how to integrate disaster risk reduction across all sectors. And this includes sectors not just infrastructure and economy, but also education. And reaching children early on is absolutely critical in that process. We really want to take what we call a whole of community approach, one that engages youth through the schools, and one that engages the elderly and the vulnerable and those, so that we have a whole of community response to disaster.
I know that recently UNDP just launched the Something School campaign. So do you mind sharing with us more about this campaign?
Thank you so much for asking about this campaign. Suntin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes,
Sunting.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a legend, as you know. And this is really, it's a legend about when the sea, the spirit of the sea rose up. But even as it rose up with all the waters and the storm, it was not able to defeat Suntin, the mountain. And so that's the name that we've given to the campaign to remind children and others who are part of it that when there's a flood, when there's a tsunami, it's time to get to higher ground. And this has really been a campaign to engage youth and engage them in the schools and to really bring together education, tsunami drills, and awareness raising so that students are really prepared next time around. We've engaged adults as well and families in the process. So far, we've reached about 3,000 people, I think, with the campaign, and we're hoping to do more.
So does UNDP have any method to ensure that this campaign is truly effective in long term, rather than just a temporary movement?
And I think one of the early things we've been able to do with the campaign is really create a movement. It's a movement where many people have been involved. It's also involved, and I think part of the attraction to it has been the engagement of some of the local celebrities. But your question is very good, how to sustain this afterwards, and that's absolutely critical. And what we want to do to ensure that this is sustainable is really integrate some of the training, key training and drills components into the school programs themselves. So this should be incorporated as a regular part of the education program, and drills should be held every year. It's something we need to have very much at the forefront of our mind so that when and if a disaster strikes, there's no question. Everyone knows what to do.
As part of the campaign School of Something, traditional games were held at the area of Hoàn Kiếm Lake, the center of Hanoi, to raise awareness of tsunami risk and of disaster prevention. Although traditional and folk games are very popular,